Hi, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. My name is Thaddeus Walsh. I'm a solution engineer over at CMD. Happy to be joining Cypher on this wonderful Wednesday. So we're going to be talking today a little bit about payment card systems, how to secure the infrastructure underlying in cloud and traditional data centers. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the common attacks and some of the mitigations that organizations can put in place in order to be able to secure their environments. So we've got two speakers today. Jake King, he's the Chief Security Officer and co-founder at CMD. He's a longtime security practitioner specializing in infrastructure security, primarily in cloud environments. So prior to starting CMD, Jake managed the security program over at Hootsuite, where he experienced firsthand the risks pertaining to Linux systems at large scale. And CMD was born out of those and many other frustrations, quickly becoming one of the hottest startups in the cybersecurity space. Jake is a frequent speaker on the topic of Linux security at events such as B-Sides, MITRE, and other conferences. He is also an active member of the Vancouver cybersecurity community. In addition to Jake, we have David Rickard. He is the Chief Technology Officer over at Cypher North America. He leads the service delivery and technology strategy for Cypher, and Dave has over 20 years of experience leading the security policy and management for leading technology companies. He is also the lead for scoping cybersecurity strategy for financial institutions. So just a couple of housekeeping elements. This is going to be approximately 60 minutes. Jake is first going to speak to a number of the common attack vectors that we observe in the wild. And then Dave is going to speak about protections and countermeasures, solutions that his organization has put in place for some of their clients. We're going to wrap up with a Q&A at the end. Feel free to enter questions into the chat, and we'll take those questions at the end. This webinar is being recorded, and we plan on sharing it out following the conclusion of the webinar. So with that, thanks so much, everybody, and take it away, Jake.
Awesome. Thanks, Thaddeus. Appreciate the time. It's awesome to be on the webinar today. There's a couple of photos of us looking pretty sharp pre-pandemic. I'm assuming for the most of it, at least for me. So as Thaddeus mentioned, one of the things that I wanted to talk about, as the onset to this conversation today was really some common attacks and adversarial methodologies. Really bringing in some examples that have been seen in the wild over the last kind of 12 months. We're in a, kind of a pre-post, depending on where we live, pandemic world. And we're really seeing a lot of interesting attacks, some really unusual patterns of behavior. And I wanted to talk through some of those adversarial situations just in the context of modern adversarial behaviors. And secondarily, I did want to touch on a few points just in regards to, kind of high level of how these can be impacted, how these can impact systems and some of the considerations you have. Just before we kind of jump into it really rapidly, one of the things that I often find comes out of a lot of the presentations that I put together is really thinking through the methodologies that we have as defenders. Is really, it's incredibly important to consider things that are the near miss, the compromises that we see in the industry, to really hone our skills as practitioners to look to where the adversary may be going next. And really thinking about ways that we can identify how adversaries are going to be coming into our networks, what they're going to be doing once they are in those systems, they are on those hosts, they are doing different things in our environments, and really finding efficient ways and effective ways to build a strategy to defend against those systems. And obviously, we'll hear a little bit more about that later in the presentation. But really use these examples that I'm providing today to kind of really talk through different weak points in your own organizations and look to ways that you can better understand ways folks will compromise a network or compromise an environment to gain access to your network. Just as we kind of get into this a little bit, I thought I'd give a little bit of background of why we have some interesting perspectives on breaches at CMD. So, as some of you may know, we build a cybersecurity software for Linux systems, and specifically Linux systems in clouds and data centers. We focus on very bleeding edge technology to provide constraint and control in environments that have very sophisticated, very complex workloads that kind of have those crown jewels of your network on them. And our pride is in really defending those systems at their core, building really strong defenses against common attacks, common methodologies that folks may use to get into those systems. And we're often seeing these pivot from a different part of the organization. What do I mean by that? Often it's not a system compromise, an exploit being run on a host directly logging into your production workloads. We often find that there is an upstream compromise somewhere else in the organization that was leveraged to gain access to production or workloads that you've running those sensitive workloads on. And you'll tend to find that because of those upstream attacks, they're moving into these systems laterally. We take a very interesting vantage point of the system. We get to really understand the way the adversary operates, what they're trying to do, what they're acting on objectives for. And this gives us a very unique perspective as to how many of those breaches in the last 12 months have really escalated into large scale or really problematic situations. And so I've come up with 3 kind of high level points today that I wanted to cover. And obviously we'll be covering some mitigation strategies around those as well. But know that these are the entry points to more sophisticated systems within your network. Adversaries are going to be trying to find those crown jewels, those gold and diamonds stored within the organization to take advantage of those systems to either ransomware them, compromise them, or share them with those competitors that we don't want finding out our secrets. And so really where we have to start a lot of these conversations from, and especially where we start a lot of these conversations from at CMD, is looking at the data. Verizon's DBIR is a really great resource for those that are interested in looking at different ways that their industry, their vertical is to be impacted. I pulled a financial services example right here, and those verticals do change slightly. So make sure you're looking at the right vertical for the type of business you're in. If you're in manufacturing or services, the kinds of exploits and attacks adversaries are using on organizations within that space are slightly different, and often different for good reason. There's more effective manners to get into some of these networks, given the kind of systems that are commonly in place. So what stood out to me on this report? Well, we can look to the human element and credentials and social engineering and basic web application attacks. But one of the things that I did want to point out were the things that weren't being seen in many of these infrastructures and environments. The things that aren't being seen a lot take up a lot of the, kind of the news and media cycles as well. So 3% of breaches involved vulnerability exploitation over 2020. This fact to me was really interesting because what it shows is that there are very intricate and easy to implement methodologies that are less complex for adversaries to take on as an entry point to your organization. We often think that we've got to invest in the very sophisticated, very complicated EDR solution across the network. Well, maybe implementing some simple training measures and actually implementing controls around credentials, credential access, and the kind of things individuals can do on systems may be a more effective, kind of solution for the problem. I'll take a look at one of the other sides of the coin here, kind of looking at the ways that these exploits are carried out. Everything else in denial of service really kind of turn out to be insignificant specks in the grand scheme of things. And so what we like to look at here is not only look at the obtuse, the very, kind of substantial portion of those infrastructure and environments, but really look to the inverse, where we can deprioritize some of our time from a planning, from an investigation perspective, from an organizational perspective, and invest in those areas that we can really get into deeply. So thinking through this data a little bit more, I wanted to come up with a generic example that applied all 3 of the components that I'm going to talk about in the next few slides. This is a very standard exploit chain. When I was in my pen testing days in the early days, I studied, I focused, I spent a lot of my time on entry team work, entry point work where human elements are used, phishing campaigns are executed, and those phishing campaigns are leveraged to gain access to an entry point within the environment giving you a really clear perspective of what that environment may have within it, understanding the systems, the services, the tools that an organization may be using. What email client are we using? What presentation software are we using? What tools do we use day to day? And then those obviously escalate into lateral movement. Once that foothold's gained, we've got an employee that'll click a link inside our emails. Then we're going to start trying to do credential harvesting. We may try to implement credential reuse, check common databases or common tools for credentials that have been breached or leaked as part of an organizational gap in a control, a breach of a third-party service, a kind of deficiency in the system that we've built. And then lastly, really gaining persistence, looking at ways that an organization has implemented different parts of their network, the way that they've started to, spread out the tools that are across their infrastructure, across their network, and have segmented or failed to segment those systems. So persistence can be gained and tools can be planted in those networks, allowing those adversaries to return or sell that access to third parties. And at that point, we've really kind of started to look at that entire life cycle of the entry team work that a team may have done. These three kind of examples here are really real world examples that are used in organizations every day. Thaddeus and I have seen this numerous times in customer conversations and environments where a phishing email was turned into credential theft, which was then turned into a payload being deployed on a server and on a system. And because of these complex networks and systems, building solid defenses, takes time, but defending against these kind of problems takes an immense amount of time. I included some statistics from Symantec's research earlier this year on the average life cycle of a breach. Soup to nuts, starting the exploitation, that entry point, all the way to resolution. And 315 days popped out to me as a step here. But I think what was more surprising for me as a responder, as someone who addresses and works with organizations, wasn't the 228 days that it takes to detect these kind of breaches. It was the 80 days for remediation that really kind of got me thinking, well, okay, we've got some problems here. Once we have found the problem, it's taking us a long time to try and solve it. And I'll speak through some of these examples in some of the organizations that we've seen in the last 12 months that have been breached. So, one of the things that I did want to make mention of is I used this slide at an ISACA presentation earlier this year. And it's not only those kind of classes of attacks that we're seeing in the wild. Misconfigurations in services, our cloud hosting providers being compromised, data centers being burned to the ground for availability reasons. When we think about the landscape of cyber threats today, we have to think broadly. And a lot of the ways we do this effectively at CMD is we help organizations defend those Linux production systems and workloads through really rigorous planning and procedural work that they have in place in their organizations. Build the defenses at the way that you need to defend the systems and address the concerns at the top layer. But getting into this a little bit more specifically, I wanted to start with something that we all know and love. Those emails from our HR team, the emails from our organization about notices to do with office closures, shifts in time zones, adjusting hours and working conditions, or even just notices about the kind of things going on with the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, this has impacted everyone in very different ways. And in the tech industry specifically, many of the folks that are working in an office have now worked from home for even the majority of their time at many companies they've worked within. The pandemic really profoundly changed the effectiveness of phishing for adversaries. And this is primarily due to that primary means of communication being the email, being what was in the inbox, what was in your inbox when you woke up in the morning to go to work. Not only this, but the adjacencies around email phishing became very effective because we were able to use the fact that systems weren't being as patched as rigorously. Not everyone in their home has a 100 megabit connection to the internet that can download that 7 gigabyte update from Microsoft for Microsoft Windows. And because of that, adversaries took advantage of the lower frequency in updates and slower time to deployment for a lot of patches to systems. Not only that, but a lot of the gateway tools, the technology that we've invested millions of dollars in over the last 10, 15, 20 years in some of the businesses we work with becomes ineffective when your organization isn't coming in through those tools. Your employees aren't logging onto that VPN every time they go to work, and perhaps even taking those calls from the home office in a bit more of an insecure way. These secondary and tertiary controls that we'd identified became incredibly interesting from an adversarial standpoint, and something to consider around defending these kind of systems is going to be brought up a little bit later today. But what I did want to make sure everyone fully understood is these attacks are on the rise, even more so effective when we are not at home, when we're not at the office, when we're not thinking, and when we're making those clicks happen too quickly. But it doesn't necessarily just stop there. We talked about phishing being the entry point. And I wanted to talk about a really common vulnerability or exploit type or class that we've seen in the past, especially on Linux systems growing in a pretty substantial way. As many of you may have known, the Pegasus malware that was shipped recently by the NSO group was leveraged to target very specific individuals on brand new, fully patched iOS devices. Apple's been well known for the security posture for the last, quite a long time. I'd say the last 20 years. But when we think about the implementation of the controls that they put in on their devices, compromising these systems took investment, time, and money, but it's able to be done, and it's able to be done silently. That malware and payload threat is only growing because now we're not only out of the office, we're working from home, we're doing different things. We're pushing a lot of trust and interconnective tissue to really key and critical parts of our systems to the edge. The amount of times that we've seen the drastic change in whitelisted ports and VPNs and exposed services into production infrastructure, specifically for companies that build applications and software, process payments, implement connective tissue to their financial processes and brokers. These systems have been exposed, and they've been changed fundamentally as we've started to move more distributed. These payloads are getting sneaky from the delivery standpoint as well, laterally moving from a standard mobile device into an internal network that isn't defended. I don't know about many of the folks on the call today, but when we think about our home router, it may not have been patched as frequently as that of what's in our corporate offices. And we think about those controls being put in place. Broad spread international attempts to compromise thousands, tens of thousands of devices were undertaken in a silent way and only identified after key stakeholders within organizations had presented some of these findings to Amnesty International for these reports to be produced. The critical challenge here is it's not even that we're able to look at the growth and the frequency of these problems. You can see the absolutely incredible just intricate amount of domains that were tied to this one specific exploit chain within the NSO group's findings. And what's fascinating about this challenge here is because those are getting exposed, because we're able to detect them, we're now struggling to find many of those logs, given that we don't have as much verbose logging on the edge, on the networks that our devices are in. Considerations that we should have here, again, will be brought up later on in the call, but one of the big payload challenges that we're dealing with right now is these payloads aren't only targeting mobile devices and endpoints. We've seen a huge growth in exploits being run on Linux systems and production servers in similar ways, taking advantage of those exposed services and ports, gaining access to systems, and then running and laying dormant on those hosts for extended periods of time. Lastly, I wanted to talk about probably the big elephant in the room. When we talk about exploitation of systems, phishing and those kind of things can be trained into our employees. We can force them to run malware and antivirus software. We can look at behavioral tools like CMD for our production workloads. But when we talk about credential compromise, egg is on the face of the employee that has reused the password a few times, maybe added a few exclamation points or an underscore at the end to get around it, that pesky rotation policy that we have in place, and maybe even has used that password a few times with different services. Commonly used passwords were implemented during that Colonial Pipeline breach that we all heard so much about and paid premium gas prices for quite some time for. Those commonly used passwords were then leveraged to gain access to a corporate network. This initially started through a breach that was exposed on the darknet. This was an exposed service, a list of credentials that was exposed about an employee. And the adversaries implemented a payload that would ransomware lock systems, which is the only time that the Colonial team actually identified these payloads within their environment. When we're getting told that we have to pay money to decrypt our systems, it's a bad day when that's our notice. The challenge here, though, lied in the fact that the adversaries had tried to enter into the infrastructure network of the colonial systems, and it impacted 29,000 miles of pipeline throughout the organization's management chain. And not only this, when investigators actually came to assess the impact of those systems, fundamentally, it wasn't that they hadn't segmented networks correctly, but it was in that the segmented networks and perhaps hadn't documented those changes well enough to be able to identify that adversaries hadn't jumped that gap. They hadn't been able to enter those systems. Mandiant was the research firm doing a lot of the work here. And fundamentally, in a lot of the release information, a lot of the publicly shared documents, what we've seen and what we've heard has really exposed what the kind of physical impacts of compromise, specifically from a single credential to a multi-stage organizational attack through weaknesses within those implementations start to look like. Cloney was a real kind of eye-opener for a lot of the community out there. This really impacted a lot of people's bottom line, and in turn, people start to listen. When we think about this, we've really got to look at ways that we can build effective mitigations, because it doesn't just stop at the high level of these exploitations. Effective mitigations don't start with physical controls or logical controls. They often start with planning. Just Dave will get into a little bit later on today. One of the biggest things that we identify within a lot of the organizations we work with through poor planning efforts. When we look at different exploits, when we look at different payloads, when we look at different ways that systems are implemented within organizations, it's often the failure or lack of documentation or planning, or even training in the software that we've deployed, that makes these exploits and chains really, really difficult to detect and prevent. Building really comprehensive programs is a very effective way to do this, but they can be quite cumbersome and quite expensive to implement. So working with professionals that have done these kind of tasks before becomes very important to organizations that are starting out in their cybersecurity journey and looking to expand the coverage, expand the kind of things that they're trying to do. And while you're looking to defend the edge, one of the things that I would say is a lot of these exploits took advantage of the fact that we're working from home, we're working in a different location, different environment. If we're thinking about the edge, we're thinking about the endpoint. When we think about the endpoint, think about the runtime. Where are those critical controls in your infrastructure? Where have you deployed and spent that, kind of critical cybersecurity budget to defend systems? And how have you built a defensive strategy that's going to address the concerns for you? So a few tips there. I'll pause right now while we can set up Dave for jumping into countermeasures. But thank you for the time, and we'll continue here. You'll be able to continue now, Dave.
Very good. Take myself off of mute. Click screen 2. There we are. That should be visible. Jake and Thad, can you see this? Awesome. Thanks, Jake. That was a very, very good chat. My name again is Dave Rickard. I'm the CTO of North America for Cypher Security, part of a much larger company named Prosegur. We can talk about some details of that. Now, as Jake called out, time to recognize a breach is over 200 days in 2021. Last year, Ponymon's, in addition to Symantec's metrics, Ponymon came up with 209 days it took to recognize that a breach had happened, and 52 days just to contain it after that. And that illustrates, I think, that as human beings, we have something of a prevention bias. We want to put up as many protective measures as we can to keep the bad thing from happening. As security guys, doggone security guys, what we try to do is make behaviors that we know incurs risk, make those behaviors be impossible. But still the bad guys will get in. The threat actors will find ways around all of that using many of the techniques that Jake has discussed. And it's not a matter of if it happens to you, it's when. In fact, what we're talking about is a 30% probability that you will incur a breach cost of $4 million within the next 24 months. And if you take the more than 200 days to recognize that it happened, those costs can very likely double. So how do they get in? What can we do to protect ourselves from things like that? Today, we're talking about specifically phishing, credential compromise, and malware. And also, as Jake pointed out, they do play a role one with each other. They tend to cohabit, they coexist, they are simpatico with each other. And so we'll talk about these one at a time. I'm not using arrows, but one second. There we go. What is phishing all about? I may have advanced too far. There we go. You should be looking at a definition of phishing, which of course, fraudulent, malicious emails, pretending to be from parties that they are not, but being convincing, sometimes very convincing, in order to get you to reveal information about yourself, whether it's passwords, PCI information, credit card numbers, social security numbers, whatever they can use to further research you specifically, in order to be able to get more information about you and consequently from you. There are two major ways to start to protect yourself against these kinds of threats. One of them is email threat protection, and ETP is a product line. This is a cyber product line that is in wide use. At Cipher, being an MSSP, we manage ETP for a lot of our clients, and we find that certain products within that field can be incredibly protective, like 99.9% effective in preventing phishing attempts and spam and malware that is being delivered via email. And it's a piece of cake to deploy, and we'll talk about that here very shortly. And secondly, training and awareness. The cornerstone of any security program is training and awareness, and we can run phishing simulation campaigns, and we'll talk about that. So how does email in general work? First and foremost, this might get a little bit technical, but bear with me, okay? Because what this will do is illustrate just how easy it is to deploy ETP, email threat protection. We have the guy who is sending an email, the phishing sender in this case, and he has on his end of the connection something called an MTA, a mail transfer agent. And when he clicks send, the MTA comes to life. This would be his email gateway, and his email gateway goes out to the internet and says, what is the mail exchanger or the email gateway for Cipher.com in my case? And the DNS system, domain name services, is yet another internet service. The DNS returns an IP address back to the MTA that the sender is using. Now he knows my IP address. He can route across the internet. Hopefully it's in 10 to 12 hops. More than that, it gets real slow. More than 30 hops, it won't get there, okay? But we're talking about just plain old routing across networks until it reaches the email gateway or the mail exchanger, the MX record that the DNS returned. There we are. Now we're on premises, so we're in the cloud depending on what platform you're using. The email gateway then forwards that to other servers which house your mailboxes, and it winds up in your mailbox. That in essence, in a simplified version, that's how SMTP or Simple Mail Transfer Protocol works. So how does ETP fit into this? It just pretends that it's in the middle. All you have to do to deploy ETP is make one little change to your DNS so that your mail exchanger points to the ETP service that you're using. And then the ETP Cloud Management Console is configured to forward mail that passes its checks to your email gateway. Now, what does ETP actually do? What it will do is it will analyze each mail message that comes in, and it will virtually click links, detonate those in a sandbox environment to where it can't escape, and evaluate the results that it gets. Likewise, it will click on attachments virtually and evaluate the results that that gets. It will do heuristic evaluations of message bodies themselves. And based on all of these checks, it will either pass or fail the email message. Ones that are good, it'll pass through. Ones that are not, you have some choices. We can either just throw those into the bit bucket and discard them. We can quarantine them and send notifications. All of these are configurable options for ETP. But again, the best of breed of these, Cipher finds to be 99.9% effective. And so a lot of the phishing and spam and malware borne by email never gets to your mailbox. Major plus in guarding against ETP. Now, when you're managing that, it does incur some admin overhead, right? But that again is where an MSSP like Cipher comes into play. We do manage this for a lot of our clients. For some of them, we just sell them the service and set it up for them and allow them to administer. There are lots of options, and MSSPs like us are quite flexible about that. But you can get information about what in aggregate are the threat alerts that we're seeing. How many have we trapped? How many have we thrown away? How many have we quarantined? How long have they been in quarantine? Do we want to set an expiration on those? There's all kinds of variables that you can set with that. We can investigate individual messages down to details, and we can configure policies. Perhaps we're getting something from our marketing people. They want to test their marketing campaign, but it's getting blocked by our ETP coming into our environment because it's coming from our domain to our domain, and traversing the internet to do that is possibly not something that should ever happen. But we want to get the marketing emails, and so we can whitelist mail exchangers, MTAs that are sending email, or domains. Of course, the more exceptions we make, perhaps the less effective ETP becomes. So again, the security guy wanting to make behavior impossible that incurs risk, we try to keep a lid on things like that. But we'll talk to you about it. Happy to talk to you about those sorts of things. Now, what about training and awareness? There are companies that will, as a service, provide phishing campaigns for you. What you do is you phish your own users. You can craft a very convincing phishing simulation to send to your users. A lot of them are out of the box. But they can be incredibly convincing. In fact, the very first time that I myself, as the corporate security guy, some time back, I was using a service called ThreatSim. Since it has been purchased by Wombat Security, an excellent learning management system. Look into them if you're not already. KnowBe4 is another one, equally good. But I was using ThreatSim, and I had to make my own email simulation at that point. I had to craft it myself, and came up with one that informed my employees that they had been charged $9.99 from Amazon for a copy of Hunger Games. And that kind of tells you a little bit about how long ago that was, Hunger Games. And this kind of threw a lot of my user base, some 3,500 users worldwide, into a tizzy. But it was convincing enough that one user in England actually got a refund from Amazon for it. And once it was pointed out to them that this was a simulation, this was a test, he refunded the money back to Amazon. Thank you very much. And we modified our training program for phishing campaigns a little bit so that if they fell for it, if our users clicked a link or anything else like that, then a browser would pop up and give them a short training, a brief training. Brief is important because if it's real long, we find that users tend to just pop it back down and ignore it. Gamification is a really important ingredient in this. In fact, when you're running phishing campaigns and you've been doing it for a few months, and you have a user pass you in the hallway or in a Zoom meeting, as the case may be these days, and they say, I saw that you tried to trick me with a phishing simulation again, but I didn't fall for it this time. But you hadn't sent one. Now you know your training is being effective because what they have actually done is trapped a real phishing attempt. So what are some things that the training could include in order to educate your users about just what this is really all about, phishing wise? You can show them examples. These three are worldwide examples for internal phishing campaigns that Cypher runs for clients. These are examples that we pop up. And oops, sorry about that, wrong button. Let's click here. What are some things to look for? There's something called a simple name. That is a sending name. You have the sending email address. There is a reply to address as well. If the name says Dave Rickard, but then inside of greater than and less than signs, it says joeattacker@evil.com, then you have a good reason to be suspicious of that email in general, because the sender name, the simple name, don't match. That's kind of a dead giveaway. If there are MS Office attachments, be suspicious. Of course, people are very prone to be sending Office attachments quite a lot, but there are much better ways to share data within your organization than that. And in fact, we'll talk about kill chain here in a minute. That it is a very common way for threat actors to gain a toehold in your environment by downloading a Trojan because you opened an Excel spreadsheet, for instance. If you're prompted to change your credentials, absolutely, that nobody will ever do that. If they do that and it's a real attempt, tisk tisk, because that is just something that should never ever happen. If you're prompted to change your credentials by clicking on a link or anything else, just don't do it. If a threat is issued in the message body that says, we need you to complete this or your account will be locked out within 12 hours, or if you don't click this link within 24 hours, you will be billed a certain amount. That's a dead giveaway. It's a phishing attempt, and it's almost a sure bet that it's true. If you hover over a link and it shows that where you would go to, a little pop-up will happen when you hover over a link with your mouse. A pop-up will occur and it will show you where you're really about to go. Evaluate that. Before you click a link, hover over it, take a look, see what you're about to encounter there. Which takes us to malware. Now, a lot of times what the phishing attempt, if you fall for it, what happens is it will download a type of malware. The malware most typically these days is a Trojan horse. So what a Trojan horse does is it gains that initial toehold, and then it says, okay, I'm here, now what? It contacts what's called a command and control server most typically. There are some variants these days that are interacting with each other. The Trojan horse installations interact with each other. They have gathered a bit of intelligence, and so they're communicating with each other, or again, a CNC server, command and control, to say, okay, what kind of reconnaissance should I do now? And the Trojan horse downloads a malware that does scanning, does reconnaissance, gets an idea of what address space is, what services are running, what segmentation exists within the network, things like that. Based on those results, the Trojan horse will then download yet something else, which could be ransomware. It could be spyware. It could be a virus that it would attach to another program that's already installed on your endpoint. Worms are more of a technique these days than an actual category. Worms' specialty is propagation, which I think is an important point, especially if you look at the history of viruses themselves. They've been a topic of conversation for a very long time, more than 70 years. The first paper was released about self-replicating and reproducing software before there were systems that you could run such programs on. And yet people were already thinking about something that could self-replicate and self-reproduced. And it was a good 20 years later that it first started popping up, first in fiction. Now, ARPANET that's the predecessor to the internet. This is the Advanced Research Projects network that was used at the time for the DoD. ARPANET distributed the first actual example in 1971 just to prove that it was possible. It also had already existed in popular fiction, such as a book called The Scarred Man in 72. In 1973, there was Westworld that was all about a virus that ran rampant among robots in an amusement park. I'm sure that y'all can recognize that or remember that. Now, in the 80s is when viruses first started really getting in the wild. And the very first one was written by a ninth grader. It was distributed via floppy. It was specific to Apple IIs, Apple II PCs. The very first IBM PC virus was actually an attempt at copy protection by some coders in Pakistan. But since they worked, other people picked up on these ideas. A lot of the communications in those days was not through the internet, it was through dial-up services that were Wildcat bulletin board systems and things like that. But the information still did spread and spread very fast. By the 90s, viruses were propagating more widely. One of the first in the 90s was called Michelangelo. It would turn your PC into a brick. if you didn't have the latest updates to software. And that's a common theme that persists to this day. Do patch management, keep everything up to date. In the 2000s, viruses and malware became very common threats, and they've evolved since that time frame to now, to what we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of Trojan horses. We're seeing a lot of ransomware. We're seeing a lot of distribution methods that focus initially entirely almost on phishing attempts. Things like systems being out of patch. The Equifax breach a couple of years ago, for instance, that was 2 summers ago. That was because of an unpatched Apache web server system in their environment. But those are getting increasingly rare. More and more social engineering attempts such as phishing, either by email or by phone or by text, etc. Those are becoming the most commonly used attack vectors that we're seeing. Malware has several phases. It can get installed. It's not taking any action yet. It may have sent off out to a CNC server to find out what it wants to do next, because generally they're controlled by threat actor groups. Then there's a propagation phase. Reconnaissance has been performed. We've figured out how we can replicate ourselves and move laterally across internal networks and distribute even more widely. At that point, then we will have defined something that's going to trigger activity. Once we get to a state that the threat actor wants, he knows that that's advantageous to go ahead and execute, to detonate the payload, to go ahead and exfiltrate data or perform a DDoS attack. In fact, DDoS attacks, the distributed denial of service, is being used as a ransom technique the last 18 months or so, quite commonly. They'll take your system down because it's flooded with too much traffic and tell you that for a fee, they'll stop their attack. So all of these things are very, very interrelated for sure. Now, how do you go about tracing back what happened? There is something called a cyber kill chain. And as an MSSP in our day-to-day investigations of events that are happening across our entire client base, we are doing activities like this. Now, this particular one is called the Lockheed Martin kill chain because it originated with an attack that they experienced about 10 or 12 years ago. I think it was in 2010. That an HR person, one person, received an email. It was a phishing email. It had an Excel spreadsheet attached to it that included a 0-day attack, one that had never been seen before. And so AV systems, antivirus systems of the day, didn't have a signature for it, hadn't seen it, we couldn't recognize it, right? The HR lady looked at the title of the Excel spreadsheet and it said 2011 hiring plans. And so she opened it. This was a Chinese entry point into Lockheed Martin right here in Atlanta. I'm in Atlanta in a suburb just north. Lockheed Martin is in Marietta, just 10 miles to the south of me. It happened right here. And it propagated. It did a lot of reconnaissance, propagated itself, gained access into very sensitive information stores. And 6 months later, the Chinese had an F-22 facsimile with no R&D money, no nothing, no billions and billions and billions of dollars that had been spent on that development. So Lockheed Martin came back and said, okay, how are we going to figure out what happened? And this is how this particular model of a kill chain was developed. First, they do reconnaissance, then they weaponize, then they deliver the weaponized portion of their payload. Then they exploit to further propagate, they install. They communicate with command and control to get their trigger point, and then they take actions on their objectives, usually to exfiltrate data or to exfiltrate money from their ransomware victims. Now, this has been updated in more recent times by a company called the MITRE Corporation. They are a nonprofit. They provide services for government and DoD agencies, and they've expanded on the Lockheed Martin kill chain model to where we still have recon, we've got weaponized, we've got delivery, we're exploiting what we can based on the discoveries that we've made. We've exercised some amount of control, we execute them. What it does is it goes into some more detail into what can analysts do to track these kinds of activities and movements. What we want to do with the kill chain is get to the root cause, because just as the NIST framework divides all security operations into 5 control areas, that's identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. By the time we get to the recovery phase, we want to have lessons learned. We will have contained a threat. We will have remediated a threat. But now we want to learn lessons from the entire experience and modify our operations so that hopefully it doesn't happen again. But if it does, then we minimize the potential impact of it. That, of course, is the goal of all engineering. First of all, we want to lower the probability that the bad thing happens. And then in turn, we want to lower the impact that it has, the consequences that results from such things, which takes us to credential attacks. Now, a lot of credential attacks can be circumvented just by policy and procedure and training. Again, the cornerstone of every security program. There are a variety of ways that credentials can be gained. Phishing is one of them, trying to get users to fall for something that pops up and says, please change your password to something else. Tell me your current password, by the way, in order to be allowed to do that. That should never happen. Never, ever do that. But that is a very common way for credentials to be gained. Social engineering can be performed as well. Just looking at what you have on social networks, your family aspects, your dog and your dog's name, all kinds of things like that. Once they figure out the taxonomy of how your credentials are formed in your company, is it first name dot last name? Is it first initial last name? There's a taxonomy to how all of these credentials are created. Once they figure that part out, they're halfway there. All they need to do is figure out what your password is. And that can actually be, in many, many cases, very easily brute force. Password policies and how to construct a secure password is not something that we'll be talking about today, but look at Cypher's site. We've got blogs about that. Please do. There are ways to make your password much, much more secure. Once they're used, if your network is unsegmented, then these compromised credentials can potentially access all kinds of things that you'd rather they didn't. For instance, if your corporate network and your production network aren't segmented away from each other, if they don't have very strong access control mechanisms in place to keep them separated, to keep people out who don't need that access, this is the least permissions aspect of security philosophy. Unsegmented networks can increase your risk level quite a bit. Now, what are the most common ways that credentials get commented or compromised? Excuse me. A lot of people publish their email user or their user email addresses on the web. Don't do that. Instead, if you want people to contact your sales team, have an account that is group use that is called sales@domain.com. If it's for marketing, marketing at domain.com. Support would be support@domain.com, not individual user accounts. What that does is it gives away the taxonomy of your domain and a perfectly valid address that anyone could expect to be live. Another thing that a lot of people do is allow user accounts to have privileged account access. Now, this would be like domain administrators in a Windows environment, or the equivalent of root on a network level for NAS use within Linux or Unix networks. Don't let your user accounts have admin permissions. It's the kind of thing to where they used to make t-shirts that said got root, because those of us in the olden days who had root would brag. Don't let anyone have root, and don't give root permissions to somebody's user account. Make them use a different account for those, one that they use for nothing else. And don't let user accounts have local admin permissions. That means that potentially unwanted applications will be in your environment. They'll install anything they want. You should use multi-factor authentication. What is that all about? Well, there are 3 mechanisms that can be used for authentication. It can be something you know, that's your username and your password. It could be something you have, that would be your RSA dongle or a device that generates a code. It could be a Microsoft Authenticator or Google Authenticator, likewise generating a code that perhaps you would append to the end of your password. Or something you are. This is biometric. It would be retinal scans. It would be thumbprints, things like that. So use at least two of these in combination, and people, even if they gain access to credentials, if they don't have that other aspect, that other factor, they still can't get in. So use multi-factor authentication. It likewise is not difficult to deploy. Security policy and acceptable use policies. Again, this is some of this information that's in all these bullets we've talked about in the last few minutes. Don't publish email addresses. Don't use corporate email for personal use. Oh, that's a sticky point for an awful lot of people. It dates back to the .com days, to where the big corporate desire was, we want everyone to use their computer as much as they possibly can, as much as we can convince them they must, so that they become more conversant in so doing. It was the 90s. It was that way. Don't let that happen. Personal mailboxes are more prone to attacks. And one of the payloads of those attacks will be to harvest all of the email addresses in that personal mailbox's contact list. If your business address is in that contact list, guess what? Now you're on the propagation list. Don't let users have local admin permissions, as we discussed. Don't let server and network admins use their own credentials for privileged account activities. By the way, Dave Rickard at Cipher.com is not my actual email address. Okay, I'll just leave you guessing on what it actually is. Never mind. Use some next generation endpoint protection and phishing protections. This is a big deal. Old-fashioned antivirus based on signatures is not going to be that effective for you any longer, because attack vectors have matured beyond that. 0 days, morphing viruses, ones that are fileless and execute completely in memory. They might only leave a fingerprint of one little registry entry in a Windows box. And that kind of wraps up what we had to talk about. Of course, Cipher can provide services for you for all of these things. Our core business is 24/7 monitoring and escalations, either as a managed detection and response platform that we host the SIM for you. That's a security incident and event management platform. Whether it's managed security services that can apply to all of your controls, whether it involves GRC consulting for PCI, NIST, ISO, GDPR, intelligence services that can help through our R&D labs provide you threat intelligence, red team services that can be called in if you have a real problem. Let our red team services come and solve your problem for you. Most of our red team service clients become 24/7 monitoring clients for us. And generally, as a result of all of this, we make recommendations about how to improve security, which might involve new technologies in your environment. We can help you decide on which are most appropriate, which fit your budget the best, and how to integrate those. Which brings us to questions. Thad, what do we have for questions coming in?
Yeah, excellent. Thanks so much, Jake and Dave, for the rundown. It looks like we've got a question for, I guess, both of you. The Colonial breach response seems to be rapid given the complexity of their infrastructure. Why is that the case?
Well, that's an interesting one. I'd say a lot of it comes down to proper planning in a response, kind of mechanism that they have in place, and a really mature security practice. That the interesting thing about it, as Dave mentioned, a lot of these programs that we put in place come from points of experience. No doubt the Colonial team has experience in building a sound response plan. But they've also clearly built measures across both their corporate and their industrial system networks, their infrastructure system networks, to be able to identify that a breach was contained at an early point. Dave, any comments?
No, not really. And in fact, you and I were discussing the Colonial thing just before we started this show. And I was speculating, well, gee, they had to shut down everything based on a breach, which informed me that maybe they weren't adequately segmented. And Jake says, no, I've talked to those guys. And in fact, they were very highly segmented. They just didn't document it very much. And so nobody knew where all the controls were.
Yeah.
Big deal. Big deal.
Fascinating to see where the gaps tend to be. Yeah.
So this one, I think, probably appropriately goes to Dave. Should I hire a company to improve our cybersecurity, or should I do it myself?
And the answer is that depends. If you want to do 24/7 monitoring and escalations yourself, there are a lot of factors you have to take into account. First of all, if it's 24/7, you're talking about a minimum of 6 people that you're going to need to cover shift work, because that's what we're talking about at that point. Finding the talent is a huge challenge. MSSPs already have that. But when you total up the cost of that talent and the square footage to put them into, all of the training that incurs, all of the other hiring aspects of it, equipment and so on, you'll spend probably about 8 to 10 times more money by building your own rather than buying services from an MSSP like Cypher. And that is really, between the talent and the expertise and then the cost, those are the most compelling reasons to use an MSSP rather than build your own.
So Jake, you did build your own when you were at Hootsuite. What were sort of the most lingering costs and challenges that you ran into in that process?
Technical debt and training was one of the biggest challenges we ran into. We had sufficient staffing, but it was ensuring that the team knew the tools. And specifically, we were responding to a cloud infrastructure network. The team knew the tools to respond to the threats that were in that infrastructure and knew how to find where those tools were. One of the bigger challenges that we had started to see, obviously a lot of the inspiration behind CMD, was being able to give my team tools they would be able to leverage very rapidly, but feel very intuitive. Learning how to lock out a Linux user account, learning how to shut down a process or terminate a system is very difficult when development teams deploy that system on a new cloud service provider every 3 weeks. And so, one of the bigger challenges was we were able to attract the talent. We were a hot company in Vancouver, but where that started to fall apart was making sure those folks had the right training.
Awesome. And I think we probably have time for one more. Where is the line between my cloud vendor's responsibility and my responsibility for cybersecurity?
Dave, do you want to tackle that one first?
Sure. I'll take a stab at that. The thing about cloud providers is that the resources that they are tasked, that is their responsibility to keep breathing and have attacks bounce off or be remediated such that it doesn't have an effect, are the networks that they're using for their cloud services, the hardware that those services are running on in highly virtualized environments to spin off Dockers and microservices and whatnot. That infrastructure is what they're tasked with protecting. What you configure on those services and use them for is up to you. If you're building Linux servers in AWS on VMs or Azure, then the security of that server itself is up to you as the customer. The security of the network, the software-defined networking aspects of it that allows people access to it, likewise, that is on you. That is not part of the cloud provider's responsibility.
Yeah, there's the specific model that a lot of people refer to as the shared responsibility model. And at CMD, we kind of tread this line of delineation really clearly with our customers, but many vendors can kind of blur those lines with servers that are hosted in their network and combining different tools and kind of infrastructure. So understanding the responsibility of constraint or control or response for those system components is hugely important. I actually just spoke on this topic a few weeks ago, and there's a blog post on the CMD blog just about this specific topic, but it is a really, really tough one to get right. So it's a good question. And my only comment would be to definitely pull from the resources that are out there on cloud hardening procedures, practices, best practices to really get in front of that. And as you start to mature that plan, CMD can definitely help out too.
Awesome. Well, that brings us to the top of the hour. Thank you so much, Jake. Thank you so much, Dave. Really appreciate your time and all the insights. Thanks everybody for joining us today. As I mentioned at the top, we're going to be cutting this recording and making it available for watchback if you have any colleagues or folks that you think could pull some value out of it. But thanks so much, everybody, and have a great Wednesday.
Thanks, folks.